Hello and welcome back. This time, chapter 15. What a marathon this week has been. I'll bet you've never done 4 chapters in a single week, but we've tried to summarize them. And this one is very important, though, because whether you're an institution having to implement PCI or you're the user, which is you and me, every time we swipe a credit card, this is confidence in the system that it's trying to protect us. According to the Federal Trade Commission, the percentage of Americans who've been victims of credit card fraud is 10%, debit card 7%, right? That consumer liability is limited by federal law, right? And the balance is borne by the merchants. So merchants want to do a lot to ensure they comply with PCI, right? So there's the Fair Credit Billing Act and the Electronic Fund Transfer Act that govern credit card, debit card, and ATM liability. That's why I love this chapter. It protects us, right? For example, it ensures a maximum liability, the FCBA, of $50. If I report the credit card stolen before it's used, if I report it stolen before it's used, I'm not responsible for any authorized charges in general. That's how it works. So good stuff. Now, the goal is to protect cardholders, you and me, against misuse of our personal information. And so these major credit card brands got together: Visa, MasterCard, Discover, JCB International, and American Express. And they formed what is PCI, the Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council. And in that council, they developed the PCI Dss, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, which businesses apply to protect us and to protect themselves, right, according to the law. So the payment card brands can levy heavy fines and penalties against your organization if they don't comply with the requirements. And so policy becomes very important in this case. These are our objectives, okay? And these I mentioned were the payment card industry stakeholders that formed the council. Okay, and so the payment card brands contractually require that every organization that might store, process, or transmit any cardholder data comply with this DSS standard. Okay, and it applies to all components, whether that account data is stored or processed or transmitted, right? That's the bottom line. And so they're looking at account data in these system components. And so per the standards, there's a PAN, which is a primary account number. And this must be stored in an unreadable format. You and I know unreadable as encrypted. And so sensitive data can never be stored post-authorization, even if it's encrypted. Good to know. The PAN is the defining factor in this PCI DSS set of requirements, right? And it applies, again, PAN, to whether the data is stored, processed, or transmitted, right? And again, I mentioned it must be stored in an unreadable format, and sensitive authentication data may never be stored, as I've said. Again, notice that on the credit card, right, the PAN is the basically the account number, right? Which is repeated on the magnetic strip. The magnetic strip also contains encoded data required to authenticate, authorize, and process transactions. We've all seen the security codes on the back, which can vary by brand, right? So these are ways of physically or logically segmenting the cardholder data environments. And so PCI DSS requires that segmentation. Even utilizing, when you're creating policy, utilizing third parties to store, process, or transmit the data does not relieve a covered entity of its PCI compliance obligations. Now, so the PCI has then this framework and to validate their compliance, right? And it's based on 6 core principles, which are shown here. And the book goes into some detail on the 6 core principles, but it does so through 12 top-level PCI requirements. So the top 12 PCI requirements relate to those 6 core principles that the PCI Council is trying to implement. And the requirements are reflective of information security best practices. You'll notice on the top of page 488 of the book, it lists the top level requirements. For example, install a firewall. Do not use vendor supplied defaults. We know that in security. We know always change default passwords and parameters, right? We need to protect any stored cardholder data. We need to encrypt all transmissions. We make sure we have antivirus or malware protection always up to date. We limit people by policy for need to know, right? We've talked about that and separation of duties many times. We've talked about identification and authentication of access and to track access through logging and other things. So the rest of the chapter goes through each of these 6 core principles and the 12 top level requirements in some detail, and we will just kind of go through them quickly ourselves. So we want to install and maintain a firewall. We want to, as I mentioned, we want to make sure vendor supplied defaults are changed. We want to use secure technologies like SFTP, Secure File Transfer Protocol, not just File Transfer Protocol. We want to make sure it's secured. Notice on page 489, it talks about protecting cardholder data, which is about masking the PAN when it's displayed. As you recall, I mentioned a few minutes ago that the PAN was the primary account number. It should be masked and rendering because we don't want somebody even writing it down on a sticky piece of paper and taking it home with them, right? We want to mask it and rendering the PAN unreadable anywhere it's stored and encrypting transmissions. We want to maintain a vulnerability management program. This is the 3rd core principle. And it includes protecting the system against malware and doing regular updates, right? We've talked about. We want to develop a secure architecture, right? And apply best practices of section 14 of ISO. We want to keep up to date on what are new vulnerabilities and assess those risks. We want to apply best practices like OWASP, for example. Which we've talked about in other courses many times, the web application of best practices. They have 12 or 20 secure coding best practices. So, and we want to focus on malware tools. Malware was used to go after Target's point of sale terminals in their breach, which gave away all kinds of credentials and credit card numbers. SQL injection has been used many times to implant malware to do this also. So you really want to be careful there. We want to implement strong access control, picking up now on page 492 and 493. We want to set default cardholder data. We want deny all. That should always be the security professional's default. Deny all, and then allow access as permissions are authorized based on roles, job classification, etc. And we want to make sure we do identify and authenticate access, right? The three primary objectives to this requirement is to ensure that every user is uniquely identified, and to ensure that the strength of the authentication credentials matches the risk, and also then to ensure that the session doesn't have unauthorized access to it. And by that you would use single-factor authentication potentially. Two-factor authentication is always recommended. That's dual factor. And multi-factor could be 2, 3, 4 forms of authentication. And implement session requirements, right? Like a maximum time for each session while a card is being processed. And then, of course, you want to maintain information security controls as part of this. I did want to mention skimming. Skimming has come up in other courses, and as a security professional, I'm always concerned about skimming. When I put my credit card or debit card into a gas pump, I always shake it first to make sure it's not loose. People will come by and put a skimmer on top of there, and it will actually collect your credit card information. The book on the bottom of page 493 talks about skimmers, and it mentions the Verizon report. Verizon has an annual report. You should sign up and subscribe to that. If you Google the Verizon annual data breach report, you can get access to it. And it will talk about skimming. I always shake the card reader, make sure it's not loose. That's a sign that there's a skimmer. And I always put my hand over when I load my PIN to make sure that somebody can't associate the PIN with the card, which is multi-factor authentication. I have the card, which is something you have, and the PIN, something I know, right? So I'm doing multi-factor authentication. In fact, the Secret Service, they talk about on page 494, says that thieves travel to the U.S. for the very purpose of stealing credit card and debit card data. So it's important for merchants and even us as consumers to inspect for and recognize skimming devices, right? So I've shared some of the ways that I like to do that. Now, continuing with PCI, they talk more about monitoring and testing networks, maintaining information security policy. And the security policy piece on page 495 is all about implementing these 6 core principles and the 12 top level requirements. So your policy should incorporate all of these if this is the industry you're in. Okay, so they give a nice chart on page 496 and 497 and 498 on PCI topic summaries and the cross-reference by the various chapters in this book. That's really great. Now, just to close it out then, so who is required to comply with PCI DSS? Traditionally, the merchant is defined as a seller. And so they don't use the term store, seller, or retail. Instead, they focus on the payment side, the transaction itself, right? So there's a level 1 merchant, which is somebody that processes over 6 million Visa payments a year. A level 2 merchant, which processes 1 million to 6 million. A level 3 merchant will process 20,000 to a million, and a level 4 merchant. And based on the level, there are various levels of reporting requirements, right? Whether you have to do a full audit inspection, whether you do a survey and supplement that, etc., right? And if you have to do a full inspection, it will end up in a ROC, right? A ROC is part of the process that will conclude you have to submit your report on compliance, or ROC, right? And the report would have these various steps in it. Otherwise, you might have to do a SAC, SAQ. This is a validation tool for merchants that are not required to submit the on-site data security assessment that, again, ends in a ROC. Okay? And of course, there are substantial penalties for non-compliance. That really concludes these 4 chapters as we set security policy. Thank you for your time. I'll see you online.